What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you 5 affordable 5G phones you can get in 2023. And by affordable, I mean less than $500. In fact, way less for that matter. So definitely some great deals here. Now, as always, if you do want to learn more about any of these phones individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So first up, we got the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G. Now this phone is the successor to last year's Samsung Galaxy A13 5G that was originally launched in December of 2021, so quite a while now. But this phone did come out in February of 2023, and compared to the A13 5G, I would say this phone is definitely a solid improvement. Today, at full price, you can find this phone for around $199, and I feel like every carrier nowadays has at least somewhat of a deal on it, so most likely, you will be paying quite a bit less. With this phone, we're getting a real nice display. With the 6.6-inch 90Hz PLS LCD display, we're also getting a real sharp 1080p resolution, a PPI of 400, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So overall, definitely a great display here, and for a 5G phone you can get for under $200, I am impressed that we do actually get a 1080p resolution, because I feel like overall most entry-level 5G phones around this price range, despite not having bad displays, typically only have 720p. So getting that nice sharp image with this phone is definitely a great thing. So if you're consuming a lot of content, like watching videos for example, where the image quality is a bit more important, then this phone is definitely a great choice for that. Now for storage, the A14 5G is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so pretty decent here. 64GB isn't really a ton of storage, but for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone and you make sure to offload stuff like photos and videos, for example, onto a microSD card, you will get by just fine. But of course, if you're more of a power user, if you're someone who's constantly downloading all kinds of apps, games, stuff like that, you might want to get something that has a bit more storage. But again, for the average user, 64GB is at least acceptable. For security features, the A14 5G does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key, so definitely a great spot for it. Can't go wrong with that. But let's give it a try real quick. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So real fast and responsive, no issues at all. For the camera setup here, up front, we got a 13 megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Definitely a decent camera setup here, but unfortunately there's no ultra wide camera, so if you do want to get those wider angle photos, you will be a little disappointed. But again, overall, the camera setup itself is pretty good, and the phone does take really good pictures. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the A14 5G, and yeah, definitely good photo quality here for the average user, for stuff like Instagram for example, and then things that are a little bit less impact like Snapchat, where the pictures are gonna go away anyway, or maybe just casually sending pictures to friends and family, stuff like that. The camera we're getting here will definitely get the job done, and it really goes to show if you want to get nice pictures, you really don't have to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone, because for the most part, for things people are typically using their cameras for, the A14 5G will get the job done just fine. And for video, this phone does have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K here, but considering this phone is less than $200 even at full price, for most of you, that's probably not much of a surprise. But if you are coming from maybe an older flagship phone for example, keep in mind, even at this point in 2023, most of the lower end phones can't record 4K videos. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM, and depending on the version you get, you're either going to get the Exynos 1330 processor or the MediaTek Dimensity 700. Now if you are in the US, and you're getting this phone through a US carrier, chances are you're going to get the MediaTek one, but overall in the grand scheme of things, the performance should be similar. And speaking of performance, I would say this phone is pretty good. Definitely not the fastest phone in this video, but for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, watching videos every now and then, and maybe some light mobile gaming, for that sort of activity, the A14 5G will get the job done just fine, and for the average user, you will get a good experience. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands compared to your current device, because of course, depending on what you have, it may or may not actually be a performance upgrade. But again, I feel like for the average user, while this phone is definitely not the fastest phone ever, it will at least be good enough. For the battery, the A14 5G has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 15-watt fast charging, so definitely a great battery here. The charging speed is at least decent. 15 watts isn't really the best, but for the average user, it will get the job done just fine. And with a 5000 mAh battery, in the US at least, this is pretty much much the largest battery you're going to find in a smartphone. So with the A14 5G, you can expect to get some great battery life. So if that is important to you, this phone is a great choice. For the software, the A14 5G does have Android 13, and with Samsung software support, you can also expect to get several other major updates in the future. So if having the latest version of Android is important to you, definitely a great choice here. And then this phone also does have NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, you won't have to worry about that either. And speaking of other features, one thing I do want to point out, just because this isn't the case with every phone in this video, is that with the A14 5G, we actually do have a headphone jack, as you can see here. So if you do have a pair of normal wired headphones, you also won't have to worry about that with this phone. Up next, we got the Google Pixel 6a. Definitely more of a higher end device compared to the A14 5G. And for what it is, I feel like especially nowadays, with it becoming more and more affordable for the money, it does have quite a bit to offer. Now, if you want to see exact pricing, again, I will be linking to all that in the description. And depending on carrier deals, I know some of them do actually have some pretty good deals on this phone, but in general, I've seen this phone going for around $300-400 on Amazon, and that's factory unlocked, which typically ends up being a little bit more expensive than getting it through a carrier. So overall, for what it is, definitely a really affordable device. Now with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting a 6.1-inch OLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 429, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So definitely not the largest display here. In fact, out of all the phones here, the Google Pixel 6a is the smallest. And while to some people this may be a drawback, I know a lot of people, at least in my comments section, do tend to prefer a smaller, more compact device. And seeing as at this point in 2023, I want to say the average smartphone display is around 6.5 inches. Getting a quality phone like this that's actually a bit more compact is definitely not as common as it used to be. So if you are looking for something a bit more compact, maybe you really just don't need a huge 6.8-inch display, then the Google Pixel 6a is a great choice for you. And as far as everything else goes, the image quality is great. I mean, with an OLED display, the colors and brightness and viewing angles are going to be really good. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, this phone is going to be quite a bit easier to see than something like an LCD. And of course, with a 1080p resolution, we're getting a nice, sharp, clear image. So despite not being the largest display out there, if you're consuming a lot of content like watching videos or playing games, things are still going to look real good on here. Now for storage, the Google Pixel 6a is getting 128GB of internal storage, but unfortunately with this phone, there is no microSD card expansion. Now if you're coming from a phone that does have microSD card expansion, and that's just something you're used to, this might sound like a huge drawback, but keep in mind, 128GB is a pretty good amount of storage, and for most people, you're probably not going to need a whole lot more than that. And sure, you can offload stuff like photos and videos onto a microSD card, so not having that option can be a little disappointing, but with the Google Pixel 6a, as with pretty much any Android phone nowadays, Google Photos is really well integrated here. So if you're okay with using cloud storage, not having a microSD card might actually not be much of an issue. Now, that being said, I know there are some situations where having a microSD card is just better. I mean, if your current phone does have microSD card expansion and you have all your information on that now, transferring to a phone like this that doesn't have microSD card expansion can be pretty annoying, but overall for the average user, even without a microSD card, 128GB of internal storage is pretty good. But of course, if you really do want to use a microSD card, then this might not be the phone for you. Now for security features, with the Google Pixel 6a, unfortunately this phone does not have Face Unlock, but we do get a real nice in-display fingerprint scanner, so let's try it out. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So real fast and responsive, no issues at all. I don't really know why this phone as a more high-end device doesn't have Face Unlock, but considering with iPhones, for example, it's the complete opposite. They have Face Unlock but no fingerprint scanner. I guess when it comes to some of these higher-end devices, we really can't have everything. But regardless, the fingerprint scanner is great here, so definitely nice to see. For the camera setup, up front, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the selfie camera. This camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 12.2 megapixel main camera and a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. Now, don't let this fool you. Despite having a dual camera setup with relatively low megapixels, along with the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, the Google Pixel 6a really has one of the best cameras in this video. So if you are taking lots of pictures and photo quality is important to you, this phone is really a great choice. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the Google Pixel 6a. So yeah, great quality here. You're really not going to go wrong with this phone. So if you're maybe like a content creator, for example, and taking pictures is really a larger part of what you're doing with your phone, I would definitely go with a phone like this over a lower end device like a Samsung Galaxy A14 5G. Because although something like the A14 5G will at least get the job done in most situations, the Google Pixel 6a is really on a completely different level. So if you are looking for that kind of flagship level quality, but you don't want to spend $1,000 on something like a Google Pixel 7 Pro or a Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, then a phone like this is definitely a great alternative. And keep in mind for video, this phone can record 4K videos in the rear camera, but you are limited to 1080p in the front. Now, I don't don't know why they did this, because I feel like even mid-range phones like the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, for example, can record in 4K in the front camera, but regardless, the video quality is still good, and it can at least record real nice 4K videos in the rear camera, so I guess it's not too bad. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the Google Tensor processor. So overall, definitely a great processor here. So if you're going to be on your phone a lot, especially doing more demanding activities like high performance mobile gaming, for example, this phone is going to be a great choice for that. And while it may not be quite as fast as like an iPhone 14 Pro Max or a Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, keep in mind again, you can get this phone for easily under $400, if not under $300 with some kind of carrier deal. And for the money, you're really not going to find a mid-range phone that's anywhere near as fast as this phone is. So if you are looking for something a bit more affordable, but you also want it to be really fast too, you're definitely not going to go wrong with the Google Pixel 6a. Now here are the scores I got on Geekbench 6. So again, definitely compare this to your current device, but again, overall, for what it is, definitely one of the faster devices here. And if you are looking for a phone that has really good performance, then you will definitely be happy with this phone. Now for the battery, this phone is okay, but not really great. With this phone, we are getting a 4,410 mAh battery that supports 18-watt fast charging, so definitely not bad at all, but compared to phones like the A14 5G that have 5,000 mAh batteries, the battery life is just not going to be as good. So if that's really a priority for you, then you might want to get something else. But in my experience, if you're around a charger at least a decent amount of time throughout the day, you should be at least okay. And one thing I do want to point out is, although I personally haven't really experienced it that much, if you are using this phone really heavily, it is a bit more prone to overheating than your average device. Now, again, I really haven't experienced it that much, but if you are maybe recording 4K videos for a couple hours straight, you might run into some problems, but in general, again, it is at least okay. And for average use, you're most likely not going to have any issues. But again, if you really do want the best battery you can get, then you might be disappointed here. But in general, the battery on this phone is at least okay. Now for the software, the Google Pixel 6a does have Android 13, which is not surprising considering it is a Google phone. And down the road, you can expect several other major updates in the future. So if having the latest version of Android is important to you, the Pixel 6a is also going to be a great choice. And this phone does also have NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, you won't have to worry about that either. But keep in mind, the Pixel 6a, along with pretty much any other higher end device you might find, does not have a headphone jack, so if you have a pair of wired headphones you want to use, you are going to need an adapter. Up next, we got a classic, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G. This phone, since it originally came out last year around this time, has been really popular, and for good reason, because for a mid-range phone, this phone has pretty much everything you could ask for. And as far as being affordable, although it was a little pricey when it first came out, at this point, now that the A54 5G is out, I have seen some really good deals on this phone, and while it does vary depending on where you're getting it, I've seen it from carriers like Cricket, for example, for even under $200. So definitely great if you want something really affordable. This still gives you a ton of value for the money. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz Super AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 405, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So overall, definitely a good display in pretty much every way. I really do like Super AMOLED displays. They always have really nice bright colors, so if you're watching videos or doing anything where the image quality is important, you are going to get a great experience here, and especially since, again, we do have a 1080p resolution, so things are going to be nice, sharp, and clear. And another cool thing about having a Super AMOLED display is, if you're outside in the sun, for example, the viewing angles are really good, so it's still going to be really easy to see. And with the 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be nice and smooth, making the phone feel quite a bit more premium to use. Now for storage, the A53 5G has 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so unlike the Pixel 6a, you actually can use a microSD card with this phone, so if that is more of a concern for you, definitely keep this in mind. And then of course, with 128GB, again, this is a great amount of storage, and for the average user, you're most likely not going to need more than this. For security features, the A53 5G does have Face Unlock, as well as a nice in-display fingerprint scanner, so no complaints here. So let's try it out. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So real fast and responsive. And taking a look at the camera setup, up front, we got a 32 megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera, and a 5 megapixel depth sensing camera. So overall, when it comes to features, this phone has pretty much everything. And then for video, it can record 4K videos in the front and rear cameras, so definitely nice too. And not only are we getting a bunch of nice features here, but the actual photo quality here is really good too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the A53 5G. And again, great photo quality, maybe not quite as good as something like the Google Pixel 6a, but in general, for actual real life use, I feel like this will be perfectly fine. If you're taking pictures for like Instagram, Twitter, stuff like that, it will definitely get the job done, and nobody's gonna look at these photos and instantly assume they were taken with a budget phone. That's definitely not going to happen. So in general, if you are looking for an affordable phone and you also really want a nice camera, you're not going to go wrong with the A53 5G. When it comes to RAM and processor, this phone has 6GB of RAM with the Exynos 1280 processor. Now for the performance, overall I would say this phone is pretty fast for a mid-range phone, but compared to something like an S21 FE or a Google Pixel 6a, it's definitely nowhere near that level. So if you're looking for a super fast device for more demanding activities, then you might not want to go with this phone, but for more basic daily use, and really the typical everyday things people usually use smartphones for anyway, the A53 5G will get the job done just fine, and even if you're doing a fair amount of mobile gaming, you're not really going to have any issues with that either. Now here are the benchmark scores I got on Geekbench 6, so as you can see compared to the Google Pixel 6a, definitely not nearly as fast, but again for the average user, it will be at least fast enough, so if you're looking for a good experience doing more basic activities, you're definitely not going to have a problem here. But again, if you are looking for a super fast phone that really has that flagship kind of performance, then you will want to get something else. Now the A53 5G has a great battery at 5000 mAh, supporting 25W fast charging, so if you're looking for a phone that has a really good battery, you're definitely not going to go wrong here. It's kind of interesting that in this price range, the batteries tend to be really good, whereas if you go to something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE or a Google Pixel 6a, and even actual flagship phones like iPhones for example, the batteries tend to be not quite as good, and I guess it makes sense to me, but at the same time it really doesn't, so just keep in mind, if you want a really good battery, and battery life is really a priority for you over pretty much everything else, the A53 5G will be a great choice. And this phone also does have Android 13, and it will be getting several other major updates too, so just like all the others, great for the software. And it also does have NFC, but one thing we're unfortunately missing here is the headphone jack. The A53 5G doesn't have one, so again, to use normal headphones here, you will have to get an adapter. And up next, we got the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE. Now this phone is pretty much on the level of the Google Pixel 6a, and honestly between the two, it's a pretty close call. I did actually make a full comparison between the two, so definitely check that out if you're interested. But in general, while I wouldn't say these phones are interchangeable, far from it. They are really similar in a lot of ways, and again, they both are at pretty much the same level, so if you are looking for more of an entry-level flagship phone, then just like the Google Pixel 6a, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE is also a great choice. With this phone, we're getting a 6.4-inch 120Hz dynamic AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 411, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So just like pretty much every phone in this video, the S21 FE has a great display, and I really appreciate how it's super bright. I mean, the others are bright too, but this is really significantly brighter, I feel like, and the viewing angles are really good too. So if you're outside in the sun, I can tell you from experience, this phone is super easy to see. So if you are actually in a situation where you might be outside a bit more than the average person, this is definitely something to think about. For storage, with this phone, we are getting 128GB of internal storage, but like the Google Pixel 6a, unfortunately, we're not getting microSD card expansion here. Again, this is really too bad, but keep in mind, with this phone, there is another variant that has 256GB. So unlike the Pixel 6a, which does only have one variant as far as I know, if you want the S21 FE, but maybe you're more of a power user and you really want more storage, with this phone, you can actually get it. For security features, the S21 FE does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here in the display, so real nice and premium. Let's give it a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go, so real nice. For the camera, up front, we got a 32MP selfie camera, then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 12MP main camera, an 8MP telephoto lens, and a 12MP ultra-wide camera. So just like the Google Pixel 6a, the S21 FE has a really high quality camera, so if you are taking a lot of pictures, you're really not gonna go wrong with this phone. And for video, this phone can record 4K videos in both the rear and the front cameras, so definitely great there. And then of course, here's some pictures taken with the S21 FE, so you can really see the quality. Definitely a great camera here, so no matter what you're doing, whether you're a more casual camera user for the most part, but you still want to get some real nice photos, or maybe you're a content creator, personally I actually do use this phone to record a lot of videos on this channel, and things have turned out pretty nice for the most part. So overall, again, along with the Google Pixel 6a, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE definitely has one of the better cameras here. When it comes to RAM and processor, with the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, this phone is getting 6GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon A88 5G processor. So this is a really fast phone, so if you are looking for something really affordable, but also really fast, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE will be a great choice. Now here are the results I got on Geekbench 6, so as you can see, it's pretty similar to the Google Pixel 6a. Again, this is an entry-level flagship phone, so compared to your typical mid-range phone, there will be a pretty significant performance difference. But if you're coming from something like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, that may be a bit older, but is still an actual flagship phone, then it might not be quite as much of a difference. So again, definitely run this test on your current phone, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands. But I would say for pretty much anyone who's using it, even for more demanding activities like high performance mobile gaming, I've done a ton of that on this phone, and I've personally had no performance issues. Now, one thing I do want to point out though is that there is another version of this phone that has some sort of Exynos processor. That's not this phone in my hand. I've personally never used that version myself. This phone in my hand, again, does have the Qualcomm Snapdragon A88 5G processor. So when it comes to the Exynos, I have heard it has some sort of overheating issues sometimes, but I can't really verify that myself because I haven't actually used it. But just keep in mind, at least with the Qualcomm version of this phone, the performance has been really good. Now for the battery, this phone has a 4500 mAh battery that supports 25 watt fast charging, and in addition to this, the S21 FE also does have wireless charging. Now, I'm not sure if that's a feature many people really care about, but I personally feel like it's at least cool to have. So if you do want wireless charging, definitely keep this in mind. But in general, the battery on this phone is at least okay. Kind of like the Google Pixel 6a, it's not the best, but it's definitely not the worst either. So if you're around a charger for a decent amount of time, but you don't need something that's gonna last for like 3 days without charging, in that case, this phone will be perfectly fine. But if you want the best battery you can get, then there definitely are better options out there. For the software, the S21 FE does have Android 13, and it does also have NFC, but keep in mind, it does not have a headphone jack. And then finally, we got the OnePlus Nord N300 5G. Now, keep in mind, you can only get this phone through T-Mobile or Metro, which is a little too bad, but I couldn't resist including this phone because for what it is, I feel like you can easily get it for free at this point. Despite definitely not being the best phone here, it does actually have quite a bit to offer. So with the OnePlus Nord N300 5G, we're getting a 6.56-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. Now, the 720p part is a little disappointing, but despite this, things still do look decent. And if you're maybe watching the occasional video every now and then, I feel like you're probably not going to have too bad a time. So while compared to all these other phones, it's definitely not the greatest here. It's at least decently large, has a pretty good form factor, a nice refresh rate, and honestly, if you're really just looking for something for more basic activities, I do think the display we're getting here will be perfectly fine. Now for storage, this phone is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely not the best storage, but for the average user, 64GB again is probably going to be okay, and at least we are getting microSD card expansion here, so that's always nice. For security features, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G does have Face Unlock, and it does have a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. Let's try it out. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And for the camera setup, up front, we got a 16 megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a dual camera with a 48 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So unfortunately not a ton of features here, but if you're really just taking regular pictures and maybe using portrait mode every now and then, it definitely does get the job done. For what it is, the actual photo quality here is surprisingly good. So if you're not really concerned about having an ultra wide camera or a macro camera or anything like that, then the camera setup here will still be at least okay. Now here's some pictures taken with the OnePlus Nord N300 5G. And again, I do think for what it is, the photo quality is really good. Sure, not nearly as good as something like the Google Pixel 6a or the S21 FE, and maybe not even as good as like the A14, but still, I feel like not everyone needs a super high quality camera, and if you are just taking a couple photos here and there, and you still want things to look nice, but you don't need top of the line studio quality, for that kind of use, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G will be perfectly fine, and as you can see, portrait mode does work really well. So even though it's not the best camera we've seen in this video, I still really don't have any complaints here. When it comes to RAM and processor, with the OnePlus Nord N300 5G, this phone has 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810 processor. Performance-wise, I would put this phone right in between the A14 5G and the A53 5G. In fact, between those three, there's not really an insane difference. Sure, I think the A53 5G might be a little bit faster, and the A14 5G might be a tiny bit slower, but in the grand scheme of things, there's not really anything one of those phones can do that the others can't, and for more normal, kind of basic activities, which is what these phones are really meant for, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G will be perfectly fine. Now here's what I got on Geekbench 6. So as you can see, pretty decent, and in general, again, for the average user, you will get a pretty good experience here. This phone may not be really what I would call fast, but it's definitely not slow either. So if you are looking for a more basic, affordable device, and you just don't really need a whole lot, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G will do just fine. Now for the battery, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 33 watt fast charging, so definitely real good fast charging here. In fact, it's actually the best here when it comes to charging speed. And not only that, but I don't think any of these phones come with wall adapters at all. Whereas not only does the OnePlus Nord N300 5G actually come with one, but it's a 33 watt fast charger, so you actually don't even need to go buy a fast charger for this phone, and you can use the full charging speed right away. And of course, with a 5000 mAh battery, the battery life here will be great too. So in general, if you're looking for a phone that has a really good battery, you're not gonna go wrong with this one. Now for the software, the OnePlus Nord N300 5G did actually just update to Android 13, as I kind of figured it would. So if you want the latest version of Android, you're not gonna have to worry about that with this phone either. But keep in mind, when it comes to long-term software support, compared to Samsung and Google, OnePlus is definitely not as good. So if you're planning on keeping this phone for maybe multiple years, you might be a little disappointed because I don't know if this phone's actually going to end up getting Android 14, but I know for a fact all these other phones will. So yeah, when it comes to software, definitely not bad here, but if you're after the best, then I personally would get maybe like the Google Pixel 6a or any Samsung instead. But if you're really just looking for something for the short term, then the software here will be perfectly fine. And this phone does also have NFC, so you can use tap and pay here. It does have a headphone jack too, so definitely nice. But those were 5 affordable 5G phones you can get for less than $500. Again, if you want to learn more about any of these phones individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.